According to the CDC, about 15 to 16% of fertile women in the U.S. are taking hormonal birth control pills. It's a lot of people. It's like 1 in 6 people, let's say, are 1 in 6 fertile women, so the ages of 15 to 44, are on hormonal contraceptive. What is the effect of that? Well, there's research to suggest that it affects the type of man that a heterosexual woman is attracted to. There's research that correlates hormonal birth control with increased incidence of mental health disorders, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, lack of libido, and future fertility problems. Now, those are, of course, the small print on the pills or the shot or the patch or whatever it is. But anecdotally, if you go around asking people, those are pretty commonly one of those or multiple of those side effects are pretty common. At the same time, what are the real solutions? How do you address this? Like everything with your health, whether we're talking about food or nutrition or exercise, it's really personal, and there's different things at different times, and there's different things for different groups of people, and you have to make a decision, an informed decision. A big problem with reproductive health is people are often making decisions in a vacuum. They're going to their OBGYN and taking whatever is given, and they're also based on what everybody else is doing. So if 15-16%, if most fertile, sexually active women are taking a contraceptive hormone of some form, whether it's a pill or a patch or a ring or whatever it is, they do it as well. And that might be a great choice for you, depending on where you are, but it might be a terrible choice if you're having certain challenges. So on this week's show, we'll be meeting with a researcher, an author, a speaker, a PhD, who has written a new book all about your brain on birth control. Hopefully it will give you some new insights and give you some new ideas. I appreciate you listening to the show. If you like the show, here's my ask to you. Support me. Share the show on social media, tag me, it's at Lucas Rockwood, and send me a question. Send me a voicemail, like voicemail, yogabody.com/Ask Lucas. Enjoy. So hello and welcome everyone. Today's show is called Your Brain on Birth Control, and I am joined here with Sarah E. Hill, PhD. Sarah's a research psychologist and professor. She studies health, relationships, and social behavior. She has a research lab in the Department of Psychology at TCU in Fort Worth in Texas. She's a writer, a speaker, and an author. We'll be chatting about her book today. It's called This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. It's available on Amazon or else on her website, sarahehill.com. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So people credit the birth control pill as being kind of the single biggest technology in terms of enabling women's rights and the women's rights movements and things like this. If I'm correct, I think the birth control was approved in 1957, something like that. What is your take on the historical context of the birth control, the importance, 60 years ago and the importance now?
Yeah, I mean, birth control and access to the birth control pill has by far been one of the biggest tools in women's advancement that we've ever seen. And I think that a lot of the strides that women have made in terms of being able to, meet long-term educational goals and long-term career goals can be credited to the birth control pill, just because having the ability to regulate fertility and being able to plan really more than anything has allowed women to dream bigger than ever before. And, so I think that the pill has really played a pivotal role in terms of allowing, women to be able to become financially independent and more competitive in the workplace and the educational sphere, more competitive with men.
So I guess things have cycles, right? So we have this, birth control technology comes out, really changes, as you mentioned, women's role in society. We think about things like, I always draw parallels to other markets, but if you think about, hybridized wheat, dwarf wheat really changed hunger around the world. And since that same time, since 1957, we just did massive things in terms of eradicating, hunger. And then suddenly we have this obesity problem on the flip side. And so, we did a really great job of empowering women to take control of their reproductive health. And then suddenly we've got this problem, in recent years of endocrine disruption, hormonal imbalance, PCOS, all these really, really common hormonal problems. And so you're now speaking out against birth control in the context of your brain. Can we talk about the brain specifically? What happens? Well, why don't we, I always like to start with basic definition. So hormonal birth control, I assume, is what you're talking about. Can you break down what different things people are doing, whether it's a daily tablet, whether it's a shot or a Depo-Provera or whatever it is? Can you break down the different types and what hormones, how this is actually working in people's bodies?
Sure, sure. But before we do that, I just want to make clear that I'm not anti-birth control. That this isn't, my book isn't a polemic about scaring women out of taking the birth control pill, and it's really important that I sort of clarify that, just because, it's about giving women the information that they need to be able to make sort of informed decisions about their health. But it's not, I think that for some women at some points in their lives, the birth control pill is still going to make sense because it's still like the easiest. In a lot of cases, it's the best thing that we have. And until we have something better, it's just really about knowing what the trade-offs are that you're making when you go on it. And so I just want to make sure that I don't want to give people the wrong impression of sort of where my stance is. I'm not pro or anti. I'm pro-woman, and I'm pro-informed consent and pro-information. But to answer your question, a hormonal birth control, whether you're taking it as a daily tablet or you're taking it as, an implant or an injection, or there's a vaginal ring, or there's, a hormonal IUD. All of those things kind of work using the same mechanism. And that is that, they release these hormones into your bloodstream, and hormones get picked up by every cell in your body that has receptors for those hormones. And so hormones travel in the blood, and they're actually sort of the body's, the endocrine system is kind of the body's like PA system. It's like a broadcast system. And it goes through the bloodstream and they travel everywhere that blood goes. And then they get picked up by all of the cells in the body that have receptors for those. Many such cells reside in the brain. And actually, the brain is the place where birth control does its magic in terms of preventing ovulation. And it does this by the composition of birth control pills or shots or whatever is generally such that it has a relatively high level of these synthetic progesterones, which are known as progestins. So it's got a relatively high level of this like synthetic progesterone. And then a relatively low level of estrogen. And when the brain reads that message, when the brain is getting a message of high progesterone relative to estrogen, or, high progestin relative to estrogen, this sends a signal to the brain that it needs to not release any of these chemicals that it releases to kickstart ovulation. Because ovulation actually starts in the brain. And the brain, when levels of hormones are low, in particular levels of progesterone, the brain will release these chemicals that sort of lead the ovaries to be stimulated and then produce an egg. And so when the brain is getting this message that, progesterone is high, which is sort of how the message is read by the brain, the hormonal message in the pill, the brain kind of stops releasing these precursor hormones, and then that prevents an egg from maturing, and that's how people stay non-pregnant. Is they're not getting this sort of a message that it's time to kickstart ovulation. And no matter where you put the hormones in your body, whether it's the IUD or the vaginal ring or the pill, they all end up in the same place, and the place is everywhere that blood travels in the body. And so, they all kind of do the same thing no matter how you get them in there.
And is there any lesser of the three? If we're talking about a hormonal IUD, or if we're talking about a vaginal ring, or pills or shots, are there any that allow you to mitigate some of the effects, or is it all pretty much just different delivery system?
Ooh, that's a really great question, and so I'm going to answer it in two ways that are going to seem contradictory. They really, it sort of all is about the same thing. Like, there isn't really a lot of research that indicates that they behave differently, except when it comes to the risk of depression and anxiety. There is some research that seems to indicate that the non-oral product, so, the IUDs and the rings and the shots and the patches, that the risk for depression and anxiety when you have the hormones delivered via those mechanisms seems to be worse, which is actually really, I think a lot of people find that. I found it a little bit counterintuitive. I know that doctors oftentimes will for example, give women the hormonal IUD and tell them that, these hormones are acting locally, which is impossible, by the way, because there's no such thing as local effects of hormones. So it's just like not true. But it also, because they're relatively low levels of hormones, a lot of times doctors and even me as a researcher, I would sort of, without any background knowledge, predict that the effects would maybe be less sort of robust there. But when it comes to the mental health links, it seems like those products actually fare worse when it comes to the risk. So there's probably some differences. A lot of the research on other like sort of domains of psychological functioning seem to show that they kind of do the same thing. But with mental health in particular, it seems like these other sort of mechanisms, and I don't know why, and nobody really knows why, but they seem to fare a little bit worse in terms of women's mental health.
And IUDs have been around forever. What is the purpose of a hormonal IUD when they're, why combine those two birth control methods? Is it a marketing thing? Where'd that concept come from?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I wish I had an answer to that. I have absolutely no idea. I know that for a while, the copper IUD was kind of going out of vogue because,
exactly.
And that's the non-hormonal, because people were concerned about copper toxicity. And so I think that led them to develop this other hormonal version, which, presumably works on some different mechanism, and then also has this hormone that's getting released. But, it could have something to do with, and this could be really surprising to your listeners, and it's surprised the hell out of me, and that is that nobody really knows how the IUD works. They just know it works. But nobody really understands, like medicine doesn't understand the mechanism. And, my guess is that it has something to do with an inflammatory response going on in the cervix, and that the body is wise enough not to allow pregnancy to occur during times when it perceives that there's an injury to sort of the place where the, embryo will be developing. But like exactly what's going on, nobody knows.
Well, just anecdotally, I know a number of people who think they have an IUD that's non-hormonal, and it's actually hormonal. So I really wonder if it's just a marketing thing. Like you said, the copper IUD went out of fashion, and many people there's backlash against the pill. The general consensus is that you gain weight, get depressed, and lose your libido. So it's not the most popular thing. But I meet a bunch of people who are getting IUDs and they don't realize it's hormonal. And I really want to get your input, because I wonder if it's just a marketing spin.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know, because I know that some women are that are very sort of proactive in terms of making sure that they're not on hormonal contraception, are getting on the copper IUD, which is the non-hormonal one, and and these other women who are on this hormonal one. I don't know if it's I'll tell you this, and you can kind of draw conclusions from it what you may. Doctors seem to really push the hormonal IUD. Like most women I've talked to have had that like really sort of pushed on them. I had it pushed on me. I didn't use it. And so like, I don't know if they just have if their drug reps are just really good at marketing, and ultimately like that's what's sort of pushing this as being the thing that the doctors are recommending so frequently. I don't know. I do know though that some women who are using the non-hormonal, the copper IUD, they also sometimes get some psychological side effects, which, sort of surprises people, because they think, well, there's no hormones and therefore this doesn't make any sense. And their doctors will say this doesn't make any sense. But, inflammation, we know that there's an inflammatory response that's being caused by the copper IUD. That's probably the mechanism of action. And even though some people can sort of handle a low level inflammatory response, this isn't the type of like huge inflammatory response that's going to be causing system wide, ailments. But it's a low level inflammatory response. And some people are really sensitive to that. And we know from, decades of research now in psychoneuroimmunology that, inflammation also influences what your brain is doing. It's like our brains are so sensitive to the state of the body, and which is great, because that sort of allows us to sort of behave and adjust our behaviors adaptively given whatever the context is that's going on in our bodies. But it can make some women really sensitive. If they're really sensitive to inflammation, it can also lead to anxiety and depression. And this can be really sort of confusing to women who have the copper IUD if they're experiencing this, because their doctors will tell them, well, there's no hormones in there, and therefore, you are not experiencing anxiety. And, as if hormones are the only thing that can influence, psychological functioning.
Right. Right.
And so, yeah.
And so I think you've touched on this already, but in terms of the brain specifically, I think most listeners are familiar with the concept of, long-term effects of hormonal birth control disrupting cycle, potentially creating fertility problems, mood problems, these kinds of things. But in terms of brain specifically, what kinds of things, again, you've touched on this a little bit, but so people can understand the neurological impacts of being on hormonal birth control, what kinds of things are happening?
Well, so before I answer that, just as sort of to kind of lay the groundwork for this, a lot of times we tend to think about our hormones as just being, especially our sex hormones, as just being instrumental in things like, sexual functioning, for example, or puberty, or, endometrial lining proliferation, or all of this stuff that happens from the neck down in our bodies. But hormones, in addition to all of those things, they play a really important, role in terms of brain signaling. The experience of being the person that we are, like your experience of being you, is something that's created by, the release of chemicals and electrical signals in your brain. And chief among these are your neurotransmitters, which of course everybody knows about and sort of appreciates their role in terms of the brain, but also your hormones. And your hormones play a really important role in terms of how you think, feel, and experience the world. And so when you change that, when you're changing a woman's sex hormones, it's going to change the version of herself that her brain creates. And what this means is that it's going to have a really, kind of a global impact on her experiences in the world. And we tend to sort of forget that. And I think that it's because we have this sort of, people tend to kind of lapse into kind of magical thinking with the idea of like a mind-body split, right? Like the brain and the body, and the mind are sort of separate entities, but they aren't. And so when you take hormonal contraception, it's going to sort of, change the way you experience the world. And there's sort of a growing body of research in psychology and in neuroscience showing that being on hormonal contraceptive can influence everything from who we are sexually attracted to, who we are actually choosing as our partners, how desirable we are ourselves as women to prospective partners, our sensory thresholds when it comes to things like scent, like we're less sensitive to smells. It influences the nature of our stress response. It influences mood regulation and learning and memory. And so, the effects of the birth control pill, even though the research is relatively new and we need a lot more before we can draw really definitive conclusions about, what pill is doing what thing to which group of women, the research that exists suggests that the effects of the birth control pill on the operations of the brain are likely to be relatively vast and to sort of operate across domains. So not just, sex-related things, which is what we tend to think of when we think about sex hormones, but that it probably also extends to influence, things ranging from how we feel to our ability to think clearly.
And so you touched on a couple of things that I know are going to pique listeners' interest, this idea of being attracted to different people and different scents being interesting. Can you touch on that? Because I know there's some interesting research that many people are not familiar with.
Yeah. No, this was one of those types of results where I found out about it and I was like brain Velcro. I couldn't stop thinking about it for a while after I had learned it. And this has to do, to speak first about the sexual attraction. There's been research for several decades now sort of linking women's levels of estradiol or estrogen across the cycle, because estradiol is something that sort of fluctuates across the cycle with fertility. for women, and it also fluctuates across the lifespan with fertility for women, with estrogen being relatively high at times in the cycle and across the lifespan when fertility is high. And there's been research now for a long while demonstrating that women's levels of estrogen predict their preference for partners who have testosterone markers. So men who have relatively high levels of testosterone tend to be more masculine than men with lower levels of testosterone. So they tend to have, deeper set eyes, a more square jaw, broader shoulders, narrower waist, deeper voices, and on and on and on, and sort of things that we think of as being masculine or sexy. And there's research showing that when estrogen is high, women are particularly attuned to these types of qualities, and they tend to really emphasize in partner choice partners who have these qualities that are associated with testosterone. And so more recently, researchers were sort of interested in looking at what happens then to women's preferences and even maybe their partner choice if they're on hormonal contraception, because hormonal contraception works by keeping women's own levels of sex hormones low. So women's own levels of estrogen are very low, and then the levels of estrogen that are in the birth control pill are relatively low relative to the level of these synthetic progesterones or these progestins. And so, the prediction that falls out of this is that we should expect to see that when women are on the birth control pill, that they de-emphasize the importance of sexiness and these sort of testosterone markers in their choice of partners, and that they might even choose as partners men who have fewer cues of masculinity relative to what is chosen or who is chosen by naturally cycling women. And there's been multiple studies now that have found this, in fact, to be the case, that pill-taking women tend to prefer male faces that have fewer testosterone markers, so less masculine male faces relative to what's preferred by naturally cycling women across points in their cycle. And there's also research indicating that the partners of pill-taking women tend to have less masculine faces than the faces of partners that were chosen by naturally cycling women. And so in these studies, they actually took a big sample of men and had the men indicate whether or not their partner had chosen them when they were on or off of hormonal contraception. They took photographs of the men's faces. They had them evaluated by a group of raters for masculinity. And they also had them go through a computer program that can actually, there's certain facial characteristics and certain ratios of width to height with male faces that can be used to sort of estimate testosterone levels. And what they find is that the pill takers were actually choosing as partners men with somewhat less masculine faces relative to their naturally cycling peers, right? And this is fascinating, and it's kind of like what you were talking about when you were talking about wheat and farming. We could be changing the face of partner preferences, and changing sort of the face of our evolutionary sort of path forward. In terms of who's getting chosen as partners and who's not getting chosen as partners by making these kinds of small changes with women's sex hormones.
It's interesting on two fronts. It's interesting because, men have low T right now. Pretty, it's a huge problem. And so it's kind of ironic that, the women are on pills that make men with low testosterone attractive when the men are generally having lower testosterone. It's almost like, right. This kind of creepy sci-fi balance act. I always say, that we have a huge problem. We do a lot of work with nutrition on the show. And we have a huge problem. Of course, people eat too much sugar right now all around the world, carbs, starch, whatever forms. And I always say the solution might not be eating less. It might be adapting so that, the superhuman would be someone who could basically just take table sugar and eat that all day and be healthy. That might be the solution. It sounds like, the secret to, if you're an estrogenic man, the secret to getting your partner to like you more is to get her on the pill.
Yeah, right, exactly. You just need to spend your time on college campuses and in graduate programs.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, it's like any woman who's trying to stay non-pregnant through her 20s or whatever, good chance that she's on the pill.
So when I guess what happens here is you start to talk about this, everybody nods their head, they say yeah, and right away people. I've met no one who said they liked the pill. I mean, every woman's reaction is it made me fat, or they say it made me depressed, or they say it killed my libido, or all of the above. None of which are really desired outcome when you're looking for sort of to relax sexually. So,
Right, yeah.
overweight, depressed, and not into it are just not exactly what people are looking for. And so, but at the same time, people want to be responsible. And, again, it's a very, very different conversation with, a partnered or a married couple who's middle-aged, very different conversation than, a 17-year-old high school student. It's just a very different time of life. So how do you help parents and kids and teens and older people? How do you help them just kind of analyze and try to figure it out? Because obviously there's a time and a place to take the pill. And then there's times and places when you need to think about other things. But how do you help people think about this strategically?
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it's just all about education, right? And a big piece, I mean, the book is, the first part of the book is just educating women about the way that hormones influence what their brains are doing just in general, because that's something that unfortunately in this country and many other countries, you need to get an advanced degree to learn, which is ludicrous. I didn't learn about the way that my sex hormones influence my cycle. And then, of course, the way that my cycle influenced what my brain was doing until I was in a PhD program. And I think that's insane. And so I spent, the first part of the book educating women about how all of this works and how they can understand who they are in terms of, in part, their sex hormone profile. And then, educating yourself about what are some of the areas in your life when we should expect that that there's going to be some impact of the birth control pill. And this is something that I go over a lot in my book, and I detail what we know and what we don't know in terms of how taking the pill influences women in these different types of domains, and then just really knowing about the trade-offs that you're making and knowing what to look out for. Because, there's almost 100 different formulations out there of pills, given the different, kinds of levels of hormones and types of artificial hormones that they're using. And so, it's really about, educating yourself about ways that you could be influenced by the pills you're taking. So that way, what trade-offs you're making, but also then keeping track of how you are doing yourself. I mean, if you feel like what you're on isn't working for you, work with your doctor to try to find something else, because there's a lot of different options out there. And so for women who want to be on the pill, if they do a little bit of troubleshooting, chances are they'll be able to find something that, even though most women probably won't love it, because a lot of us don't, you can find something that allows you to sort of feel maximally at home in your own body. Because the way that individual women respond to individual pills is one thing that's clear from the literature is that it's hugely variable. And so, the way that you respond to something is probably going to be very different than the way that your best friend responds to the exact same drug. And so it's like it's our bodies are so complex, and each one of us has these, unique body chemistry, and the way we respond to things just isn't going to always, be in a real stereotypical way. And that's why it's all about also knowing yourself. And so I recommend that women keep a journal, they keep track of how they're doing, and make sure that that their birth control is working for them, and that they understand what the trade-offs are. And so that way they can strategize birth control across their lifespan and use it, as like you were saying, at times in your life when you're 17, if you're sexually active, and you're not going to be responsible enough, which most 17-year-olds aren't. I wasn't, to be able to use something that wasn't as effective as the pill. It might make sense, right? It's a very different conversation than what you'd be having with, somebody who's 30 and married, and, maybe they want to have a baby, if they want to wait a couple more years. I mean, that might be a different choice. And so it's just all about getting the information so that way you can make the best choice for yourself, knowing with your eyes wide open, what the trade-offs are that you're making.
And what are the really obvious things that people aren't looking at that you like to educate them about? Are you a fan of the copper IUD? Are you telling people to use the rhythm method? Or for again, different people at different phases of life, but what surprises you that people really have no clue about that's pretty effective?
I mean, it really depends. I think the copper IUD is a good place to start, because for women who tolerate it well, It's a no-brainer, and like the most effective birth control is the one that you don't have to think about. And so, for women, especially for women that, absolutely must not get pregnant right now, given whatever their career goals are, or their educational goals, I think that that's a good option to try that. I also think that, like keeping track of cycles, especially with like cycle tracking apps, can really be useful, and using that sort of in combination with like a barrier method like condoms, or doing something like there's vaginal sponges and other things, using those two things together, especially if you're at a point in your life where pregnancy like wouldn't be the absolute end of the world, is also can be very effective. I recommend, even for, women who aren't necessarily sexually active and they're not on the pill, just to start tracking their cycles, because it's really, it's a cue to health. It gives you an idea of how you're doing. It gets you more in tune with your body. And I really think that, the more in tune we are with our bodies, and the more we sort of appreciate what, our bodies are doing for us, and that, our brain and like what we think and all of these things are part of the same system. I think that it sort of nudges us to take a little bit better care of ourselves. And I think that in this day and age, anything that we can do to sort of promote, full body wellness and like our, taking care of ourselves is like a really good thing. And so I recommend to women, track your cycles, do it now, start early, learn about how your endocrine system is working. And that will allow you, like, as you sort of move forward, to be able to make the most informed decisions about your health.
This is something that I think people don't think about also. Obviously birth control pill made a big difference, but not all women were just baby making machines prior to the 1950s. Like there have been methods around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And but none of those methods involve crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. Like all of them involve getting in touch with your biorhythms, understanding, communication with a partner, sharing responsibility with a partner, thinking strategically about how things work. But clearly people were not just popping out babies. I think it's an interesting time. So my parents were baby boomers. My dad, eight brothers and sisters in his family, and my mom 5. And so my kids my age growing up, we just kind of assumed that pre-birth control, when we're just popping out kids left and right. But that's not really the case. If you trace back in history, these natural techniques, while obviously are, maybe less reliable, or maybe even better stated, they just require a little bit more thought and planning. But clearly people have been able to control these things since before these came along. Sarah,
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yeah.
So I appreciate your work. I know a lot of our listeners will want to check out your research and your book. I know a lot of people have been on hormonal birth control for years, and they're thinking, they're worried about their fertility, and they're worried, the depression thing, especially for women, is such a large, I hear stats as many as 20% of women are clinically depressed, even medicated in the U.S. And so the chances of there being a correlation between the two, it seems pretty clear. So I know people will be interested in learning more about their brain, about birth control, thinking about other options. Where should we send people to check out your book and follow your work?
So you can find This Is Your Brain on Birth Control on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and IndieBound, anywhere that books are sold, or your local bookstore. And it's also, you can find links available on my website, which is Sarah with an H, so SarahEHill.com. And I'm also on all social media platforms with the handle at Sarah E. Hill, PhD.
And just one final question before we go. Do you have any, is there any indication in the future that the onus will be put at least more on men? I know there have been some early trials of male pills and things like this. Do you think there's any future there?
Here's the thing, is like women are the ones who bear the largest cost when it comes to having unprotected sex, because we're the ones who get pregnant. And because of that, women are always going to be more motivated to restrict their fertility than men. And so I think that even though I think that it's positive, and I think that men are, willing to sort of try to, play an active role in terms of contraception. Ultimately, women, because we're the ones who bear the cost of pregnancy, we're oftentimes the ones who are most motivated to be protected. And so I think that it's always going to be sort of asymmetrical, with women being the ones who take the lead on it to a greater degree than men.
Sarah, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your work. One of the most common trouble areas for yoga students is their hips. People complain about tight hips and tight hamstrings probably more than any other spot on their body. The reason our hips are so tight in Western culture is because we never sit on the floor. We almost never squat down. In fact, our range of motion in terms of our hip flexion and extension is so shockingly limited that by the time most people are in their 20s, they can't really sit on the floor cross-legged comfortably. Their back's all hunched up and their knees are way up off the ground. And this affects all kinds of things. It affects your standing posture, your running gait, of course, your ability to do yoga. Probably half the poses in yoga demand a certain degree of hip mobility. And it also leaves you susceptible to injuries. If you have dysfunctional movement patterns, if your posture is wonky, you can't really lift weight up off the ground. You can't really move like a fully functional human. So it's really important to open up your hips. It just feels great also. You're more comfortable when you travel. You can get through yoga classes more comfortably. You'll also find all different movement practices, whether you're weightlifting in the gym, out for a run, or just doing anything that you might like to do for fun, like skateboarding or surfing or whatever it is just easier when your hips are open. A lot of people don't even realize how blocked they are. I get a lot of questions. We teach a pose called Blaster in our gravity yoga series that's very popular. In any case, a lot of people want to come take my classes. I usually just teach training courses these days, so I'm not that accessible, which is a shame. I'd like to do more public classes, but I'm traveling, I'm teaching, I'm writing, I'm doing these podcasts, and I don't have much time. In an attempt to make myself more accessible and to connect with my listeners, I'm doing a 21-day hip opening challenge. It's a private program. It's available on Instagram in a private group. It's really simple. I know you already have Instagram. You just sign up for the program, you join through the app, and every day you'll practice with me live on video. I will share with you my best hip opening stretches. I'll answer questions. We'll talk about anatomy. I'll show you some bones and some anatomical stuff to think about and show you how to do gravity yoga breathing and practices to really open up your hips. Now, in 21 days, the question is, can I really make progress? And the answer is absolutely. You'll make huge progress. But even more importantly, you'll set the stage for some really massive transformations. When it comes to mobility, usually about 80% of the gains you'll ever make are made in the first year, and usually about half of those gains are made in the first month. So it's really big gains. You'll notice it right away, and it's pretty fun as well. Hip opening poses are really intense and very rewarding as well. I usually do it right before bed or in the evening because the breathing that we do with gravity yoga tends to put you to sleep. In any case, to learn more, go to yogabody.com. Scroll down, you'll see upcoming courses, the 21-day hip opening challenge. I hope you can join me. We have a listener question from Terry in regards to nutrition. Terry says, Lucas, what is the minimum baseline amount of protein I should eat to maintain lean muscle and hormonal balance? Terry, the recommendation I always give people is to baseline at 0.5 grams per pound of ideal body weight. Let's say you want to weigh 150 pounds. Eat a minimum, absolute minimum, baseline 75 grams of protein per day. So let's say you had 3 meals a day, you'd want to eat 25 grams at each of those meals. Almost nobody does 3 meals a day, and nobody does 25 grams at 3 meals a day. So what that means is maybe you need to find a meal where you eat 50 grams of protein. That's tough. Here's the deal with protein. It's incredibly satiating. People don't realize this. It's the most satiating of the macronutrients, which means it makes you full, which is why we'll tend to push away the protein and eat more starch, simply because it goes down easier. When people say that food feels heavy, sometimes they're referring to fat. Very often you're referring to protein by proxy. And here's what much of the pop health wisdom suggests: 0.8 grams per pound of ideal body weight, so a little bit higher than my suggestion. So I'd experiment. The reality is nobody really knows for sure. Because you're listening to this show, it sounds like you live in a developed country. I'm guessing that you have no problem with true protein deficiency, but that doesn't mean you don't have a protein imbalance, right? Meaning you're just eating slightly imbalanced, and it can absolutely affect things like you mentioned: lean muscle mass, hormonal health, sleep, all kinds of other things can be affected. I'll share a personal story, so we're not talking in the abstract. For many years, I was a raw foodist, and my protein intake was pretty low. And for many other years, I was sort of a raw foodist in denial. I pretended I ate other things, but I mostly just ate nuts and berries and things like this. And my protein intake was pretty low. It was probably about 50 to 60 grams per day. And I need probably about 80 to 90 grams per day right now based on my current level of activity. When I upped my protein, and I did that by just kind of forcing myself to suck down a pea protein shake every day, which is, I've got one right next to me here on the desk actually. It's kind of gross, pretty bland, no flavors or anything like that. I can't stand chocolate flavored protein, but it really made a huge difference for me. I was able to put on a little bit of weight. My body composition is better than it's ever been, so I have around 10% body fat. Able to put on muscle easier than I could in the past. I'm still a pretty scrawny guy, but that's just my nature. But it made a very big difference for me, a very small amount of protein. So the fact that you're asking this question, Terry, I'm wondering if you aren't low, and I might encourage you to get a high quality whey protein or a high quality pea protein and play around with supplementing, adding 25, 30 grams of protein a day. Give yourself a nice substantial whomp on the head and see how that makes you feel. If you notice something different, maybe you need to reset your baseline. But the pop health advice often falls around 0.8 grams per pound of ideal body weight. So a little, well, significantly higher than my suggestion of 0.5 grams. But I think the reality is that everyone's different, and most people fall somewhere within 0.5 to 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. So somewhere between, like, let's say 150 pound person, somewhere between 75 grams and 150 grams. 150 grams would be somebody with we could call them a fast oxidizer or high metabolism. It's kind of a generic term, but you get the idea. But probably somebody who's very active and somebody who is using, who's working with their muscles a lot, like an athlete. Somebody on the lower end of the spectrum would be somebody who's a slower oxidizer and somebody who's less active. But it really depends on you. I'd encourage you to experiment. It's very difficult to eat the level of protein that's going to notice a difference. I would encourage you just to whomp yourself on the head with like a nice 30 gram protein shake in addition to everything you're eating, and just keep some quantified self notes to see how you feel. Hope that's helpful, Terry. Let us know how it goes.
Hey Lucas, it's Will here. My main reason for recording this message is because I'm looking to find an EPA and DHA omega-3 vegan one, and I've been looking around and trying to find the best one. Found some that seem really great, and then I found that they have an ingredient called carrageenan in it. And I'm just wondering what you do for your omega-3 and what do you think about this whole carrageenan thing? People are saying maybe it's carcinogenic, causing irritable bowel syndrome. I'm thinking whether it is a good idea to be taking an omega-3. No, that's amazing, it's good for the brain, but if the carrageenan is potentially carcinogenic, what are your thoughts? I would love to hear. Have an awesome day.
Hi, Will. Thanks for your question. You know, if you asked me a couple of years ago, I would have had a good answer for you. I had a great brand I was using, but they went out of business, and I was actually thinking about manufacturing it myself, and I couldn't find a good source manufacturer. Carrageenan is added to many of these things, along with other weird things. I'm not confident even how it's extracted. I'm not convinced there isn't hexane and other chemical process involved. And I say that because I've tried every other brand I could find of algae oil for adults, and all of them give me really negative reactions, either fishy burps or disaster pants or a sore belly. And an omega-3 oil should do none of those things. It should do just the opposite. So what can you do? I don't really know. I'm not really so confident in adult algae oil. For people listening, people often think that algae smells like fish, that algae has a fishy smell, but really fish smell like algae. They eat algae, and that's the omega-3 fishy smell that they get. It comes from algae. So you can go direct to the source, and high-end baby formula manufacturers are doing just that. And they do it because it's a premium ingredient. It is generally thought of as the safest option because fish could potentially have mercury, which of course would be very dangerous to anyone, but particularly to a newborn. So it seems like the majority of this algae oil market is going to newborns who consume very small quantities and for a short period of time, and parents often spare no expense. For a regular family, an algae oil supplement for a family of 4 could literally cost $5 to $7 a day, which adds up pretty quickly. And again, these manufacturers are just not that great. So what do you do? Well, you could just eat chia seeds and flax seeds and chia oil and flax oil and hope that your body can convert that to EPA and DHA. I don't know. Maybe that'll work. You could also think about something like krill oil. Is krill a plant? No. Is krill an animal? Kind of. It's kind of in the murky middle, and these kinds of things are choices that we all have to make. If you're a conscious, ethical eater, I don't know. I don't have the answer to this, but it's something I think about a lot. And in the land of omega-3s, I think you have to take a look at fish oil, krill oil, and algae oil and use your best judgment. I know that's not a great answer, Will, but I hope it's helpful.
This week's iTunes review comes from Casca.dj from Sweden. Casca.dj says, "No-nonsense content, great guests, and questions discussed. I'm learning a lot and highly recommend this." Thank you, Casca.dj. You've won the Yoga Trapeze. Please email us at podcast@yogabody.com and we will ship it to you.
If you're a regular Yoga Talk Show listener, you'll definitely want to get on my email list. Go to yogabody.com/sign me up. When you enter your email address there, we always have free giveaways every month, yoga straps, water bottles, discounts in our shop, and all kinds of other things. When you sign up at yogabody.com/sign me up, I'll send you just one email a week with updates about the show, special offers, new courses, and valuable information that I think you'll find useful. So go to yogabody.com/sign me up to claim your free prize now.